The man at my door claimed he was my father's son. The doorbell rang at 11 o'clock at night, 2 weeks after I buried my father, and when I opened it, a stranger about my own age looked at me like he already knew my name. "I think your father was my father, too," he said. I stood there in my socks, holding the door halfway open, and for a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. The porch light was buzzing the way it always did in the cold, and behind him, I could see his car still running at the curb. Headlights cutting through the dark, like he wasn't sure if he'd be staying long enough to turn them off. He was maybe 43, 44, wearing a jacket that looked a size too big, and he had this nervous way of shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like a man who had rehearsed a sentence 100 times in his car and still didn't believe he was about to say it out loud. "I'm sorry." "What?" I said. "Walter Cole," he said. "That was your dad, right? I saw the obituary online. I've been trying to work up the nerve to come here for 6 days. My stomach dropped in a way I can't fully describe. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the floor tilting a few degrees, just enough that you have to grab something to stay upright. I gripped the edge of the door. "You need to leave," I said, even though some part of me, the part I hate admitting to, wanted him to keep talking. "I have something you should see," he said, and he held up a photograph, old and curled at the corners, like it had lived in a wallet for 20 years. "Please, just 5 minutes." I almost shut the door on him right there. My hand actually moved toward it, some instinct in me telling me this was a con, a scam. The kind of thing you hear about happening to grieving families when someone reads an obituary and figures out how to twist the details into a payday. But there was something about the way his voice cracked on the word father, something raw and unrehearsed underneath all that nervous shifting, that made me hesitate with my hand still on the door. "Who told you to come here?" I asked. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me," he said. "I found the obituary myself. I've been looking for him for years, off and on. Whenever I had the courage, I just never expected to find him this way." The cold air was starting to creep into the hallway, and somewhere behind me I heard the furnace click on. That low mechanical hum that used to put me to sleep as a kid whenever I stayed over at my dad's place after the divorce. I thought about my father lying in a hospital bed 2 weeks earlier, thought about the quiet, ordinary way he'd died. An ordinary man as far as I'd ever known. And something about that ordinary memory made this stranger's claim feel even more impossible. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to say something. Because I know a lot of you are new here. My name's Daniel, and this channel is called The Quiet Rise. If stories about family, truth, and the things people carry in silence mean something to you, stick around. Because we do one of these every week, and I think you're going to want to hear how this one ends. Now, back to that night, because it only got harder from there. I didn't let him in right away. I stood in the doorway with my arms crossed, looking at this man who had the same jawline as my father, the same slightly crooked smile that used to show up in old photographs from before I was born. I told myself it was a coincidence. People share features all the time, but there was something about the way his eyes moved, cautious, watchful. Like he was waiting to be told he didn't belong. That reminded me of my dad in his last years, after the divorce, after everything got quiet in our house. I glanced past him at the empty street, half expecting to see a van, a cometa crew, some kind of elaborate prank I hadn't been warned about. There was nothing, just the quiet hum of his idling car and the sound of my own heartbeat, louder than it had any right to be for 11 o'clock on an ordinary Tuesday night. 5 minutes, I finally said. "That's it." He nodded like I'd given him something precious, and he followed me into the kitchen, where the light was better and the coffee maker still had yesterday's pot sitting cold in the carafe. My wife Sarah was already asleep upstairs. I remember being grateful for that, because I didn't know yet whether this was something I wanted her to hear. He set the photograph on the table and slid it toward me. It showed a young couple, maybe 22 or 23 years old, standing in front of a car I didn't recognize, somewhere that looked like it could have been anywhere in the Midwest in the early 80s. The woman had dark hair and a shy smile. The man beside her, unmistakably, was my father, younger than I'd ever known him. But it was him, the Psalm heirs, the same way of standing with his hands in his pockets like he wasn't sure the picture was worth taking. "That's my mother," the man said, "Rosa Reyes. And that's your dad." "That doesn't prove anything," I said, though my voice had lost some of its certainty. "I know," he said. "That's why I brought this too." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket, soft at the creases like it had been unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. A birth certificate. My hands were shaking a little when I took it from him, and I hated that they were, because it meant some part of me already believed him before I'd even read a word. Father's name, Walter James Cole. I set it down on the table, like it had burned me. "This isn't real," I said. "But I said it the way you say something when you're trying to convince yourself, not the other person." "I understand if you need time," he said. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I just needed to see if it was true. My mother's dying. Daniel. She has maybe 2 months. Before she goes, she asked me to find him. I didn't know he was already gone until I searched his name last week. Something about the way he said his mother's dying knocked the air out of the room. I'd spent 2 weeks grieving my own father, feeling like grief was something that belonged only to me and my sister, something private and finished. And now there was a stranger in my kitchen telling me there was another family out there who had been grieving a version of my father my whole life, a version I'd never even known existed. "I need you to go," I said, quieter this time. He didn't argue. He stood up, left a slip of paper with his phone number on the counter, and walked out into the cold without another word. I watched his taillights disappear down the street, and I stood at that window for a long time, holding a coffee mug I never drank from, feeling like the floor of my whole life had shifted an inch to the left. I didn't tell Sarah that night. I lay next to her, pretending to sleep, running through every memory I had of my father, searching for cracks, for silences, for anything that might explain a woman named Rosa Reyes and a photograph from 40 years ago. My father wasn't a man who talked about his past. He grew up in Ohio, joined the army at 19, met my mother at 26, and everything before that was, as far as I knew, just background noise. He never bothered to play for us. I finally told Sarah 2 mornings later, over coffee, because I couldn't hold it in my chest any longer without feeling like it was going to crack something open. She listened without interrupting, the way she always does when something matters, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "How do you feel?" she asked, which was such a Sarah question, because she never tells me how I should feel about anything. She just asks, and waits, and lets me figure it out on my own time. "I don't know," I admitted. "Angry, maybe. Not at Marcus. At that a little. For never telling us. And then I feel guilty for being angry at a man who isn't here to defend himself." "Maybe he had reasons," Sarah said. "People don't usually keep secrets like that because they don't care. They usually keep them because they care too much, and they're scared of what happens if the truth gets out." I turned that thought over in my mind for days afterward, because it didn't match the version of my father I'd built my whole identity around. The steady, reliable, uncomplicated man who never missed a birthday, who taught me how to change a tire in our driveway one Saturday afternoon, who cried, quietly, the day I got married. That man didn't seem like someone capable of hiding an entire son from his own children, and yet here was the evidence, sitting in a photograph on my kitchen table, refusing to disappear just because it was inconvenient. The next morning, I called my sister Emily. "You're joking," she said, the second I told her. "This is some kind of scam, Danny. People do this. They find an obituary, they find money, and they show up with a sob story." "He didn't ask for money," I said. "He will," she said. "Trust me. This is what people do." Emily has always been the practical one in our family, the one who reads contracts twice before signing, the one who kept Dad's finances organized after Mom passed. I understood her instinct to protect what was left of our father's memory, but I also couldn't stop thinking about that photograph, about the way that man's eyes had looked exactly like our father's when he was uncertain about something. "I want to find out if it's true," I said. "Why?" she said. "What good does it do us to find out Dad had some secret family we never knew about? He's gone, Danny. Let him rest." But I couldn't let it rest. And I think some part of Emily couldn't either, because 2 days later she called me back and asked if I still had the key to Dad's storage unit. We went together on a Saturday morning, the kind of gray November day where the sky looks like it's deciding whether to rain. The storage unit smelled like dust and old cardboard, stacked high with boxers we hadn't opened since we cleared out his house. Tools, Christmas decorations, a box of photographs from our childhood that Emily had already gone through twice, crying both times. In the back corner, behind a stack of paint cans, there was a smaller box neither of us remembered. It was taped shut with yellow tape that cracked when I pulled it open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some opened, some still sealed, all addressed to a Rosa Reyes in Springfield, Illinois, all returned to sender, unopened, with a stamp that said no longer at this address. My hands went cold. "Danny," Emily said, and her voice had changed completely. "Look at the dates. The earliest letter was postmarked 1983. The most recent, 1991, 6 years before I was even born." We sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit and opened one. Just one, because Emily said she couldn't handle more than that. It was in our father's handwriting, the same careful cursive he used to sign birthday cards, and it was addressed to a son he had never met. "I don't know how to be your father from this far away, but I think about you every day, and I hope one day you'll let me try." Emily started crying before she finished reading it over my shoulder, and I realized I was crying too, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. Grief, maybe, or the strange, disorienting kind of grief you feel. Not for a person, but for a version of your own life you thought you understood. We went through the rest of the box slowly, carefully, like archaeologists uncovering something that might crumble if we moved too fast. Most of the letters were unopened, still sealed, The ink on the return address, slightly faded but legible. A few, though, had been opened and read, then folded back into their envelopes, and kept anyway, as if my father hadn't been able to bring himself to throw them away even after giving up on ever sending them. One, dated 1987, mentioned a birthday. Happy 4th birthday, son. I hope, wherever you are, someone is making today feel special. I think about you finding your first tooth loose, learning to ride a bike, all these small moments I'm missing. And it eats at me more than I know how to say. Underneath the letters, at the very bottom of the box, we found a savings account passbook, the old paper kind banks used to issue before everything went digital, with a small balance that had clearly been added to sporadically over the years, and then, at some point in the early 90s, simply stopped. Emily stared at it for a long time. He was trying to save something for him, she said quietly. Even after the letters stopped coming back, open. Even after he probably assumed Rosa didn't want anything to do with him anymore. Why would he stop? Primera, ask it. Maybe he didn't stop hoping, Emily said. Maybe he just ran out of ways to keep trying. He tried, I said. He tried to reach out. Then why did he stop? Emily said. Why didn't we ever hear about this? I didn't have an answer, but I knew someone who might. I called the number Marcus had left on my counter. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting by the phone for 6 days straight. I found letters, I said. In storage. He tried to write to you. There was a long silence on the other end, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. He wrote to us, Marcus finally said, his voice cracking in a way that made me believe, for the first time completely, that he wasn't running a scam. My mom always told me he never even tried, that he just disappeared. They came back, I said. Return to sender, every single one. We moved, Marcus said quietly. When I was 7, my mom married someone else, and we moved across the state. If he was writing to the old address, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. We both understood, in that moment, that we were looking at 2 versions of the same story, and neither one of us had the whole picture yet. We agreed to meet again, this time at a diner instead of my kitchen. Somewhere neutral, somewhere Emily could be there too, if she was ready. She wasn't ready. She sat in the car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before she came inside, and when she finally sat down across from Marcus, she studied his face, the way you study a photograph you're not sure is real. You have his eyes, she said, almost like an accusation. People have told me that my whole life, Marcus said. I never knew whose eyes they were until last week. The conversation was slow and careful at first, both sides testing the ground before stepping fully onto it. Marcus told us he grew up believing his father had simply chosen not to be part of his life, that his mother rarely spoke about Walter Cole, except to say he wasn't a good man, that he'd left before Marcus was even born, and never looked back. He told us about growing up without a father in the house, about the questions he used to ask his mother that she never fully answered, about the anger he used to carry into every relationship because some part of him believed abandonment was simply what fathers did. I used to hate him, Marcus admitted. 4 years, and now I don't even know if I have the right to hate him anymore. Emily was quiet through most of this, but I could see something shifting behind her eyes, some old certainty starting to crack. Our dad wasn't perfect, she said finally, but he was steady. He showed up for everything. Every game, every recital, every disaster. I don't understand how a man like that could just let a whole family disappear. Maybe he didn't let it disappear, I said. Maybe he thought it already had. That night, after we dropped Emily off, I stayed up researching everything I could about paternity claims and inheritance law, because as much as I wanted to believe this was simply about truth and family, I knew there were practical realities we couldn't avoid. My father's estate wasn't large, but it wasn't nothing either. The house had sold for a fair amount, and there was a modest life insurance policy that Emily and I had already split according to his will. If Marcus was legally recognized as our father's son, that could change everything about how the estate was distributed. I brought this up carefully with Emily the next day, and her old suspicion came roaring back. See, this is exactly what I was afraid of, she said. It doesn't matter how sympathetic his story is. If this turns out to be true, he could have a legal claim on Dad's estate. People don't just want closure, Danny. They want what they think they're owed. He hasn't mentioned money once, I said. He doesn't have to, Emily said. Not yet. I understood her fear, even if I didn't fully share it. Our father's death had already stripped away so much certainty from our lives, and now here was a man threatening to rewrite the story of who our father had actually been. It made sense that Emily would want to protect what little certainty remained, even if it meant refusing to see the parts of the story that didn't fit the man she remembered. I called our father's old attorney, a man named Richard Voss, who had handled Dad's will for over a decade, and I explained the situation as plainly as I could. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. If this man can establish paternity, he said, He may have legal standing to contest the distribution of the estate, particularly if he wasn't named or provided for in the will. I'd recommend a paternity test before anything else moves forward, for everyone's protection, including his. That word, protection, stuck with me. I realized that a DNA test wasn't just about proving Marcus right or wrong. It was about giving all of us, Marcus included, a foundation of truth to stand on before we let emotion or suspicion decide anything. I brought the idea to Marcus over the phone, worried he might feel accused, but he agreed almost immediately. I want the test, he said. I need to know for certain too. Not for the estate, for my mother. She deserves to know the truth before she goes, one way or the other. We scheduled the test for the following week. A simple sibling DNA comparison between Marcus and me, since comparing against our father's remains wasn't something any of us wanted to pursue. The waiting period was 2 weeks, and those 14 days felt longer than almost anything I'd experienced since losing my father. During that waiting period, something happened that complicated everything even further. Emily, still suspicious despite everything we'd found, hired a private investigator to look into Marcus's background without telling me first. When she finally admitted it, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, with a manila folder in her hands, her face had the look of someone bracing for an argument. I had to know, she said. I had to know if we were about to let a stranger destroy Dad's memory over a lie. The folder contained details about Marcus's financial history. 2 bankruptcies, a prior lawsuit from a former business partner accusing him of misrepresenting company finances, a case that had been settled out of court under a non-disclosure agreement. My stomach turned reading it. This doesn't look good, Danny, Emily said. This looks like a man with a pattern. I confronted Marcus with it the next day, feeling sick about it even as I did, because some part of me had already started to care about this man's story, had already started to think of him, cautiously, as something like family. I hadn't slept well the night before that conversation, replaying every interaction I'd had with Marcus so far, trying to decide whether kindness had made me careless. Sarah told me to trust my gut, but my gut had been wrong before, and the weight of protecting what remained of my father's memory felt heavier than I knew how to carry alone. I drove to meet Marcus at a coffee shop halfway between our 2 towns, the folder sitting on the passenger seat like something radioactive, and for most of the drive I rehearsed different ways of starting the conversation, none of which felt fair. His face went pale when I laid the documents on the table between us. That business partnership fell apart because he was the one hiding money. Not me, Marcus said, his voice tight with a mixture of hurt and anger. I lost everything defending myself in that lawsuit. That's why I filed for bankruptcy. Twice, because I spent everything I had trying to prove I wasn't the one who did something wrong. And I still lost to Luke that May, and for the first time, I saw something like real desperation in his eyes. Is that why you think I'm here? You think I'm trying to scam a dying man's estate because I've got money trouble? I don't know what to think, I admitted. Then wait for the test, he said. If it comes back negative, you'll never hear from me again. But don't punish me for a mess I already paid for. On top of everything else I've had to carry my whole life. I left that conversation more uncertain than ever, caught between Emily's warnings and my own growing instinct that Marcus's pain was real, whatever the DNA results eventually showed. The test results arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, an email notification that sat unopened on my phone for almost 20 minutes while I paced around my living room, trying to prepare myself for either outcome. Sarah finally sat me down and opened it herself, reading it silently before looking up at me with tears already forming. 99.9% probability of a half-sibling relationship, she said quietly. I don't remember exactly what I felt in that moment. It wasn't shock, not really, because some part of me had already known since that first night in my kitchen. It was something heavier than shock, a kind of grief layered on top of grief. Mourning a father, I thought I fully understood while simultaneously discovering there was an entire hidden chapter of his life I would never get to ask him about directly. I called Marcus immediately. He didn't say anything for a long time after I told him. I have a brother, he finally said, and his voice broke completely on the last word. Emily took the news harder than either of us expected. When I told her, she didn't cry, and she didn't argue. She just went very quiet, and she asked me to leave her alone for a few days. I respected that, even though it worried me, because grief works differently for everyone, and Emily had always processed hers by controlling what she could control. This was something none of us could control. A few days later, Marcus called me with something that changed the direction of everything. My mother wants to meet you, he said. Before she runs out of time, she has things she needs to say. I drove 3 hours to a small house on the outskirts of Springfield, the same town those old returned letters had been addressed 2 decades earlier. Rosa Reyes was smaller than I expected, frail in a hospital bed set up in her living room, an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose, but her eyes were sharp and alert when I walked in, studying my face the same careful way Marcus had studied it that first night. You look like him, she said, her voice thin but steady. Around the eyes. I sat beside her bed, and for the next hour, she told me a story I had never once imagined belonged to my father. She and my dad had met in college, long before he joined the army, long before he ever met my mother. They were young and reckless and deeply in love. The kind of love, she said, that feels permanent when you're 22 and know nothing yet about how complicated life can become. When she became pregnant with Marcus, my father wanted to marry her, but her family disapproved, believing he wasn't stable enough, wasn't from the right kind of family, wasn't going to amount to the future they wanted for their daughter. Under pressure, she left before he even knew for certain she was pregnant, moving in with relatives in another state, cutting off contact almost entirely. I was scared, she said. Scared of my family, scared of being alone with a baby, scared of loving someone my parents told me I wasn't allowed to love. I told myself it was for the best. I told myself he'd forget about me eventually. But he hadn't forgotten. The letters in that storage unit proved that. He had spent years trying to find her, writing to the only address he had, never knowing she had moved, never knowing his letters were simply returning to him unopened, evidence he must have eventually interpreted as rejection rather than a lost address. Why didn't he try harder? I asked, though I already suspected there was no simple answer. Because eventually, Rosa said, he probably believed I didn't want to be found, and I let him believe that, because by then I was ashamed of how much time had passed, ashamed of how long I'd stayed silent. Shame does strange things to people. Daniel, it convinces you that silence is safer than the truth, even when silence is the thing causing all the damage. She told me about the years after Marcus was born, how she'd worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, how she'd eventually married a good man named Hector who raised Marcus as his own and never once made him feel like an afterthought, though Marcus always knew, somewhere underneath the gratitude, that a piece of himself belonged to someone else entirely. She told me how Marcus used to ask, as a boy, why he didn't look quite like the rest of the family, and how she'd deflect the question every time, telling herself she was protecting him, when really, she admitted now, she'd mostly been protecting herself from having to explain a decision she'd never fully made peace with. I watched him grow up angry, she said. Not loud, angry. Quiet, angry. The kind that shows up in how a person keeps everyone at arm's length, how they never quite let themselves need anybody. I always knew part of that anger belonged to a father he never got to know, and I never had the courage to fix it while there was still time. She reached for a small metal box on the nightstand and handed it to me. Inside were photographs I had never seen. Pictures of my father as a young man, laughing in ways I barely remembered him laughing, holding a baby that must have been Marcus in a hospital room I had no memory of ever hearing about. He came to the hospital, Rosa said, the day Marcus was born. My family didn't want him there, but he came anyway. He held his son for 11 minutes before my father made him leave. I never told Marcus that until a few years ago, because I was afraid it would only make his anger worse, knowing his father had wanted him but wasn't allowed to stay. I sat there, holding that metal box, feeling something break open inside my chest that I don't think will ever fully heal. A mixture of pride and heartbreak and something that felt almost like forgiveness, though I wasn't entirely sure yet who I was forgiving. When I got home that night, I called Emily and told her everything Rosa had said. There was a long silence on the phone. He wanted him, Emily finally said, her voice trembling. He wanted Marcus, and he wasn't allowed to have him, and he spent the rest of his life carrying that alone. I think that's why he never talked about his past, I said. I think it hurt too much. All those years, Emily said, we thought we knew everything about him. We knew everything he was able to show us, I said. That's not the same thing. 2 weeks later, Emily agreed to meet Marcus properly, not at a diner this time, but at our childhood home, or what used to be our childhood home before it sold. Standing together in the driveway where Dad used to teach us how to ride bikes. It wasn't an easy conversation. Emily still carried anger. Not at Marcus exactly, but at the whole situation, at the unfairness of discovering a hidden half of her father's life only after he was gone and could no longer explain any of it himself. I'm not trying to replace anything, Marcus told her, standing in that driveway with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. The same nervous posture he'd had on my porch that first night. I just want to know where I came from. I've spent my whole life feeling like half a person, like there was a piece of my story someone had ripped out before I ever got to read it. I finally have that piece. I don't need anything else from either of you, except maybe the chance to know you. Emily didn't respond right away. She looked at the house, then at Marcus, then finally. Slowly, she extended her hand. Welcome to the family, I guess, she said, and though her voice was still uncertain, there was something genuine underneath it, something that told me healing, even complicated, imperfect healing, had finally begun. The legal side of things resolved more smoothly than any of us expected, largely because Marcus insisted, against Richard Voss's advice, on signing a formal waiver relinquishing any financial claim to our father's estate. I didn't come here for money, he told the attorney, in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over before it began. I came here for the truth, and I already have it. Everything else belongs to the family that raised him. I'm just grateful to finally know I have a family at all. Emily and I talked about it privately afterward, and we agreed, without much debate, that it wasn't right to let him walk away with nothing when our father clearly would have wanted him provided for if circumstances had allowed. We set aside a portion of the estate for him anyway, not because the law required it, but because it felt like the kind of decision our father would have made himself, had he lived long enough to make things right on his own terms. Marcus invited Emily and me to his home a few weeks after that meeting in the driveway, a modest house on the edge of Springfield where he lived with his wife, Denise, and their 2 teenage daughters. Walking into that house felt strange in a way I hadn't fully prepared for, seeing photographs on the wall of 2 girls who were, technically, my nieces. Girls who shared a grandfather I'd known my whole life, but who had never once heard his name until a few months earlier. "They know about him now," Marcus told me quietly in the kitchen, while Denise fixed plates of food in the other room and the girls peppered Emily with questions about what their grandfather had been like. I told them everything. I didn't want them growing up with the same silence I grew up with. I don't want them to inherit that. I watched his younger daughter, maybe 15, show Emily a school project on family trees, and I watched Emily's face soften in a way I hadn't seen since before our father passed. Like something in her was finally allowing itself to feel less like loss and more like discovery. Later that evening, Marcus's older daughter asked me, with the blunt honesty only a teenager can manage, whether I was angry that her father existed. I was. For a while. I told her honestly. Not because he did anything wrong, just because it was a lot to understand all at once. But I'm not angry anymore. I'm glad he found us. She smiled at that in a way that reminded me, unmistakably, of my father, and I realized that whatever else this whole ordeal had cost us, it had also given us something we hadn't known we were missing, a wider family than the one grief had left behind. A month later, the 3 of us stood together at our father's grave for the first time as siblings, Marcus holding a small bouquet of flowers he'd picked up on the drive over, standing a respectful distance back, like he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to stand closer. "You can come stand with us," Emily said, and he did. Quietly, the 3 of us forming a small, uneven line in front of a headstone that had never once mentioned the full story of the man buried beneath it. "I wish I could have met him," Marcus said. "Just once, just to hear him say my name out loud." "He said it," I told him. "In every one of those letters, he said your name more times than you'll ever know." Marcus knelt down and placed the flowers against the headstone, and for a long moment, none of us said anything at all. The wind moved through the bare trees around us, and somewhere in the distance, a car passed on the road. And I remember thinking that grief, real grief, is never as simple as the stories we tell about the people we lose. My father wasn't the man I thought I fully knew. He was more complicated than that, more human than that, carrying a wound none of us ever saw because he'd spent decades convincing himself silence was kinder than the truth. I think about that a lot now. The cost of silence, the way it can protect people in the short term, while quietly destroying entire relationships over the years that follow. My father wasn't a bad man for what happened between him and Rosa. He was a young man who made a mistake, then spent the rest of his life too afraid or too ashamed to fix it, until eventually enough time passed that fixing it started to feel impossible. I understand that now in a way I never could have before that stranger showed up on my porch, holding an old photograph and a birth certificate that changed everything I thought I understood about my own family. Rosa passed away 6 weeks after that visit to her home in Springfield. Marcus called me the night it happened, his voice hollow with a grief I recognized immediately, the same grief I'd carried after losing my own father. Emily and I drove down for the funeral, standing beside Marcus as he said goodbye to the last parent he had left. And something about that shared grief, standing together in that small chapel, made our new, complicated family feel a little more solid, a little more real. We still talk, every week now, the 3 of us. Marcus comes up for holidays sometimes. Awkward at first, but less awkward every time. He's started helping Emily go through the rest of Dad's old boxers, the ones neither of us had the heart to finish sorting through alone. And somehow, having him there makes the process feel less like closing a chapter and more like finally finishing a story that had been left unfinished for far too long. I think about that first night constantly. The way I almost turned him away at the door. The way suspicion nearly closed the door that truth was trying so hard to open. I think about Emily's fear, which wasn't unreasonable, given everything she was trying to protect. And I think about my father, a man who carried a secret for 40 years because he didn't know how to carry it any other way. A man who loved a son he wasn't allowed to raise and who spent the rest of his life quietly hoping that son would somehow understand, even if he never got the chance to explain it himself. I don't know what I would have done in Rosa's position, faced with a family that disapproved and a young man she loved but wasn't allowed to keep. I don't know what I would have done in my father's position either, writing letter after letter into silence, eventually convincing myself that silence meant rejection rather than distance. I've thought about it more than I probably should, turning the decisions over in my mind, wondering how differently things might have gone if just one letter had reached its destination, if just one conversation had happened at the right moment instead of decades too late. What I do know is this: truth has a way of finding its way home, eventually, even when we spend years or decades trying to keep the door closed. And when it finally arrives, sometimes in the shape of a stranger standing on your porch at 11 o'clock at night, the only real choice you have is whether to let it in or turn it away. I'm grateful every single day now that I chose to let it in. Some nights I still catch myself wanting to call my father, just to ask him about it, just to hear him explain it in his own words instead of piecing it together from old letters and a dying woman's memories. I never got that chance, and I've had to make peace with the fact that I never will. But I've also come to believe that maybe the explanation was never the point. Maybe the point was simply what we chose to do once the truth finally reached us, whether we let it divide the family further or whether we let it, slowly and imperfectly, make the family whole again. Emily still has hard days. She told me recently that sometimes she looks at old photographs of Dad and feels a flicker of anger before the understanding catches up to it. And I think that's honest, and I think that's allowed. Grief doesn't move in straight lines, and neither does forgiveness. Marcus still struggles too, in his own way, especially around his mother's birthday, when the weight of everything she carried alone for so many years settles on him harder than usual. We don't pretend any of this is simple. We just keep showing up for each other, week after week, the way our father should have been able to show up for all of us from the very beginning, if the world had only given him the chance. If you were in my position that night, a stranger at your door claiming to be family you never knew existed, what would you have done? Would you have opened the door the way I did? Or would you have needed more convincing before letting a stranger into a story you thought you already understood completely? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because I think all of us carry some version of this question, even if we never end up facing it quite so directly. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Maybe someone carrying a secret of their own, or someone who's ever wondered about a piece of their family history that never quite added up. Thank you for spending time with A Quiet Rise. I'll see you in the next story.